Well, I don't know. It would be probably we should start up the like an history, that's the information.
Right. Welcome everybody. Special welcome to our two independent members from the Audit and Risk Committee, Brian Jackson and Mr. Simpson. Welcome. Mark DeHaas and Ellison. Before we start, can I ask the Chief Executive to do some scene setting? I suppose that's the right choice of word.
It was a dark and gloomy night.
and it was a blood moon. That's right.
How's that? No, let's take a more positive approach. It was a wonderful sunny day. There was an awesome sunrise this morning. I could, from my place, see Ruapehu very clearly. So,
okay, it's now Marston.
I don't think that's what the Mayor wanted me to start with. So, aware that for slightly over half of the people at this table, this is the first time you're reaching this sort of point in an LTP process. It is intentional that LTPs happen in the middle of your term because I always suggest that it takes 12 to 18 months to get your feet under the table, to get used to the rhythm of a council and the things that it does. And everyone would say in a normal world, by now you're starting to get a sense of the work that goes on around this organisation and around the district. The challenge that I think we've all had is that last year wasn't a normal year either. So we had COVID, which has really messed with the way we normally operate, and maybe some of our normal rhythms aren't quite as normal. They still sometimes seem to be the first thing that we're doing. So what I want to impress upon you is that remind you that you've heard me say repeatedly, this is the biggest, baddest LTP in my 20-odd years in local government. In terms of the global and national elements that impact on our business, as well as a lot of things coming to land at the same time for us as a district. Growth, where we want to go in certain spaces, COVID reactions, resilience. We both have a need to do those things now, but we also have the opportunity due to the financial circumstances, due to the government saying this is the time you guys need to prime the pump and do a lot more than you have. And you'll see that happening all around the country. In terms of the process, though, the volume of information that you've been receiving and the pace at which you feel you've had to work does make you feel like you're under some sort of pressure. And that if I was to put words into your mouths, they may or may not include how do I know if I'm going to make the right decisions right now and not regret something later because it feels like it's all coming at me like a steam train. And I guess my response has been to some of you and is repeated to all of you, we're nearly a $100 million business. And what has been interesting is even though we've had a lot of submissions and feedback, which is great, it's what we would hope for, the financial impact of the sorts of things that we're going to talk about today are probably in the order of 200,000. There may be more, there may be less. This is not about what we've seen and heard from the submissions period. Basically, if you stick at your sort of governance helicopter height, this is not about taking the super tanker and turning it 90 degrees and going somewhere different than what we had thought. So that's the first point I want you to always keep in your mind today is that, okay, the take that I am suggesting to you is that this is largely the community saying, I get where you're going, I broadly like it, I might have some bits and pieces here and there that I want to raise or talk about. Someone will want more emphasis in this space and someone else over in this space. And that's your job, is to balance off all of those wishes and still remember that at the end of the day, not everyone's going to be totally satisfied. We cannot do everything that everyone wants. So you are going to have to make some trade-offs, some prioritisation decisions. We're going to give you our suggestions for that, obviously, as we do. Sometimes we're going to say we don't have all the information. It's not a perfect world. You've got to make a call, yes or no, or maybe. And in many cases, that's going to look like, hey, let's push that out a little bit. If it isn't a significant decision, let's push it out. Give the staff some time to work it up over the next 6 to 12 months and bring it back to an annual plan. That what I'm suggesting to you is that fundamentally, all the feedback we've had is that largely it looks like we're on the right track. And so if you're worrying about whether the $1 decision is going to be the end of the world, I'm saying to you, please don't think it is, because there'll be a whole lot of them that some will make it, some won't. But at the end of the day, 90 to 100 million bucks is going to get spent on our district, plus potentially 70 million in capex, as much of it as we can land. Those are massive programs of work, and a lot of good stuff's going to happen out of it. And if you know this organisation, where we can, we're also going to try and do more than we should to try and answer all those other things that crop up as we go through the year. So even as of today, we'll make some calls today, and in a month's time, something will come up that we haven't anticipated, one way or the other. And it's about how we respond to that. Stop that. That's very disconcerting. It's either his pulse rate or he's timing me.
I think he's probably going to be up for a month's time.
How many houses will be built by then?
Yeah. So, look, I just wanted to set that scene. I've heard some of your questions and concerns over the recent times. You know that staff are running hard to be just about a half a day ahead of you in terms of what we're doing here. So sometimes we won't have all the answers either. And with your forbearance, sometimes we'll say, can we come back to you on that? So what I'm really keen as we do our darndest today to give a really clear steer on what we want to do, but know that we've got next Tuesday to spend a little bit of time reflecting on what we've decided today. And if we don't totally get there, we've got that up our sleeve. But even better, if we do get where we want to get, you will have another chance to have another think about it and a little bit of feedback next Tuesday. After that, there really isn't room to make more changes. Finance has got to do all the modelling. It's really complicated. We don't want to get it wrong. It's got to go to audit. Our auditors need their time on it before it goes to OAG for hot review. And of course, there are potentially 60 or 70 councils. A few have signed, but there are potentially 60 or 70 councils going through that process at the same time. So we've got to be respectful of that. We would have loved to have given you an extra month or two to work through this. We never could. So we are where we are, but I think we're in a pretty good space. That's probably a lot more than you were hoping for, Mr. Mayor, but that's my scene setting.
Oh, that's good. Mark, in terms of questions and feedback process, how do you want to manage this?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you, good afternoon, everyone. So in terms of the presentation that we'll take you through, the 85 slides, there are actually section breaks. And so what we'd like to do is get through a section, get to the end of the section, and then take as many questions. Sometimes, inevitably, you may raise questions that will covered up or that will be covered in future sections. But our preference, Mr. Mayor, is to at least try and start off with, get to the end of a section, stop, pause, take the questions, then move on.
Before I forget, Jackie Elliott has given an apology. She'll be late.
Kia ora koutou. I firstly thank you for all your patience and hard work over the last couple of weeks with my emails firing out with masses of reading. I know it's been a huge commitment from all of you, and from staff perspective, we really appreciate the time and patience that you've given us through this process. So to my left is Jared Bothell from Public Voice. So Jared will introduce himself very shortly, but just so he's here to help through the first few slides. So Public Voice have, as you know, provided an independent analysis of the submissions that were received in direct response to the questions that we asked through the consultation document. So today I'll be taking you through the results that we heard through that submission process, and as we've discussed, will require a steer from you as we go, so that will help us inform the final long-term plan that will be coming to you for adoption on the 24th of June. The order of the slides is as per the order of the consultation document, which is why we've handed out the feedback form, so that'll just help you if you needed to reference back to the question that we asked or the flow of the document. So just thought that might help if you've got that in front of you as well. Sorry, I didn't change slides. So we're going to be taking you through the timeline very soon, submission results and recommendations, and then we're going to just cover off the rates, the capital carryovers and the insurance discussion. And then from there we will go through to the additional community proposals that we have received. And then there'll be an opportunity for councillors to bring forward anything else that we haven't picked up or made recommendations on from staff point of view that you want further discussion or consideration of. And then there'll be key takeouts and wrap up leading into Tuesday's workshop. So just to reiterate a bit of what you've heard, there's obviously a lot to get through, both today and leading up to adoption on the 24th. So 4 weeks from today, the countdown has started. So just to put a bit more context around that, to tie in with the audit review and the OAG hot review, by the end of next week, we have to have all the financials and supplementary information to audit. And then the following week, after the long weekend, we'll be providing audit with the part 1 of the long-term plan. So that's all the narrative around what's in the long-term plan and why, the activity summaries, and further financial information. And then from there, the full set of the long-term plan documents goes to the OAG for a hot review on the 14th. We get back those feedback, respond accordingly. On Friday the 18th of June, the agenda for the council meeting for adoption will be sent out. It's possible that the actual document won't be able to go out with that agenda. It would follow on the Monday. We're just allowing ourselves, if needed, that weekend to get everything tidied up with design and make sure it all looks right. If we can, it will come out with the agenda, but otherwise it will follow on the Monday. So I'll hand over to Jared to do a brief introduction, and then Jared will also take you through the demographic slides.
Thank you, Alison. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jared Bothwell. I'm the Director of Public Voice. We're a research and engagement consultancy based in Lower Hartlepool, Wellington. I've been in business now for 16 years. During that time, we've run a number of research projects, particularly around, we specialise in consultation projects. So to keep it sort of recent, we worked on the analysis of the Hutt City Council long-term plan process as well. And we also worked with the Greater Wellington Regional Council on it's the GWRF, which is the Greater Wellington Regional Framework Project as well. So we analysed all the submissions which related to that. They received just shy of 79 submissions. This slightly less than what you guys received, but we also recently ran a consultation where we received 22,000 submissions, and we analysed all those as well. So you're not quite the biggest we've had. And with that in mind, I think it would be useful to get an understanding of how we work and how we operate, and the methodology behind the approach that we took. So with this questionnaire, there were around 60-odd questions from memory, and there was a range of what we would call quantitative or categorical questions, which are closed-ended questions. So we've undertaken the analysis of that, which you would have seen through the Engagement HQ platform as well, which provides the pie chart that you see. So you get an understanding of certain positions towards certain topics. But I guess where the main thrust of the work that we undertake is around the qualitative analysis, and the qualitative analysis is undertaken with the open-ended questions, and there are a lot of those questions which we had to work with. So we had a team of 5 analysts that worked with the data, and that's to ensure. So we would split the project up into its various components, but we also have a quality assurance process as well, which ensures that we have basically a second person check process to ensure that there's a degree of accuracy with that. With the qualitative approach, we use what we would call both a deductive and inductive methodology. So the inductive approach is essentially we're coding up the data into themes, and based on the data that we receive, and then through that process, it's an iterative process. So you'll start with smaller type themes, and then we'll generate larger categories or taxonomies where those themes are grouped into larger groups. And at the end of that process, we'll also apply what we would describe as a deductive approach, where we might group those themes into either support, oppose, ideas. And you would have, hopefully those would be familiar to you. So Alison was saying earlier that everybody in the room's read all the submissions, and so have we. And so what that means is that there should really be no surprises in the analysis that we've undertaken. So if you would imagine if you'd undertaken a similar approach when you read through those submissions, and that you had either categorised them into certain buckets or groupings, you would have come up with something very similar to what we've done today. So what we have there is a sample slide, and of the thematic analysis. And we've got at the top there, we've divided the overall support for priorities there. We've totaled that at the bottom, so we could say there that there were 221 coded segments, we would describe them as. And so what we're saying here is that it's not necessarily an individual, 221 people said this particular thing, but within that response to that particular question, and it's probably easier to say if we look at the overall opposition to priorities. So here we've got a count of 95. Within those oppositions, people have indicated within a response that they could be opposed to a rate increase and at the same time opposed to the cavity gateway. So what that means is that when we have a response to an open-ended question, you may have that coded up multiple times if they've actually touched on multiple points or multiple issues as well. So within the survey questionnaire, which you'll all be familiar with, actually, were there demographic questions? I mean, there were people when they signed up with Engagement HQ, they could identify their location, their age, ethnicity, and that's the data that we have there. I guess what's important to keep in mind is this wasn't a mandatory question, and well, if you're going to accept paper submissions or submissions through other avenues aside from your online form, you could never really make it a mandatory question. But what we've got is a large blue bar at the bottom there, which is 29% of people that are not answered. So ultimately, it's difficult to draw any conclusions from that. But what we do have from the yellow line is the census data, and so that's the percentage of there's a population distribution using NZ statistics, and in the blue line we have the measure of response from the location data that we've received. That was interesting because I think within Engagement HQ, when people registered for to be involved, they would list that data. But because we received submissions outside of that, we were able to any data that was missing from there, we could actually also generate from the address data. So that was generally individuals, I think, that had decided to attend hearings. I think it was the address question, wasn't it? Yeah, and so that's where that location data is. So location data equals data captured from the Engagement HQ sign-up form plus any address data that may have been supplied through the feedback form. So the ethnicity questions there as well, and there's a lot of missing data there, so it's difficult to draw any conclusions from that. I guess the key thing to note is that you can't really say anything, really. Oh, I wouldn't say anything. and likewise with age as well. So in this situation, it would be difficult to really determine whether or not your responses were representative, and which I don't think is a concern with a consultation process anyway, because it's not you're not operating a sample survey. It's not a scientific. It was never designed to be a representative process in any way. So I wouldn't have any concerns regarding that. It really is those that are interested in putting forward a submission. But within this, we can see that 87% of submissions came through from an individual, 5% from an organisation, and you've got 8% of those that declined to answer that question.
Thank you. So before we move on to going through the analysis, are there any questions from what Gerard has just explained?
Can I just test it? Jocelyn, you've had issues with the sort of not answered section of the analysis. Would you like to discuss that now?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Gerard, for coming along and this report that you provided to us. So one of the questions that I've had earlier on was when we had the yeses and the nos, but we didn't actually know how many people who actually didn't answer the questions, and you've actually done a really nice job in doing that in terms of, the 2 pie graphs, which is great, thank you. But now that I do have the floor, one question that I am interested to know is that for some of the questions in particular, there's quite a high percentage of no answers. and some of the difference, and basically the difference between the yes and the no is quite small. And I suppose, and then it's extrapolated up to 100%, yes and no or whatever. So I suppose my question is, are the numbers that we're looking at, are they, well, and I know you said it wasn't a scientific survey, but are they significant? You know, can we actually say, yes, this is higher than that? Or, you know, based on the numbers and some of the very similar yeses and no, you know, can we actually say, yes, that's what people are saying here, or that's what people's knowing? Because you've got also sampling bias, which you know what that means.
I was thinking about this, and I guess if you wanted to be technically correct, you might want to have a pie graph that had no answers of around 52,000 or 53,000.
Yep.
Because that's what it is.
Oh, you know, I realise that, but it's like voting. You know, basically you've got to vote, otherwise you're not counted, and it's based on the number of people who do count, who do actually vote. So,
Sure.
yeah, but I suppose my other question, getting back to the standard deviation, or basically what is significant and what isn't.
So Councillor, remember what he said. This
Yes.
is not statistical survey.
I'm
So there are no standard deviations and
I
margins
know,
of error.
I understand that, but
So to fixate on whether this is representative or not would be to treat this wrong. The written word being turned into numerical analysis is simply helping you to get a sense of how many people said something.
yeah, and that's
It is not a popular vote. It is not a
that's
representation.
So that's exactly what So this is information that's coming to us to provide us with our decision making, as opposed to this is 52.4% versus whatever. Even the 4.4 is probably irrelevant. So yeah, thank you.
Anybody else?
Thank you.
I mean, I must tell you that this morning we had a session on methodology on the postal.
I've got a question.
Trevor.
It was coded into a thing.
Sorry, Trevor, I'm not sure what the question is.
Well, when it came to the CCO, we said we need more information before we can say yes or no to this. So how was that question? How was that answer handled?
You'll see that, okay, in the slides to come. You'll see how people who have said that sort of thing is represented there. It tells you something. It tells you that some people are saying, I'm not comfortable making, indicating support or otherwise, unless you tell me a bit more about it. And the CCO is a good example of that one where it clearly doesn't say because it's going to be used for this purpose or that. So you'll see how it's handled in some of the slides that come forward.
Yes, so Jared's just showing me on his screen. There's a specific mention of more information, and it's been coded, so we will see on the slides as we go through.
Yeah, thank you. So in terms of setting up this survey or this consultation, did you have any input into the types of questions that were asked, or you've just come in to look at the results?
We reviewed the questions, although at the stage that we got involved in the process, they were pretty much at the end of the development process.
Thank you.
I thought that was a really insightful question. Were there any questions that you had concerns with?
No. The only thing I would say is that if I was doing it, I wouldn't have so many open-ended questions because it generates a lot of work, right?
And a lot of input though.
Yes, yes. And so, I mean, there's other ways you can do it. You can just you did it with some of the questions, which is you just have a categorical yes, no, and then a comments question, which does give you slightly cleaner data. Or it's easier to analyse. But the approach that you've taken gives, while it generates more work, it does give you richer data.
Okay, thank you. So Jared will stay for a few more slides, just if there are any more specific questions around analysis. But as we go, he may slip away to do other things. So as I said, this is following the order of the consultation document. So the first discussion point was around the right priorities, so being our community outcomes specifically. So this first slide is showing the overall feedback that we received. Again, it's just to give a general feel of the themes that we saw throughout. So 221 times there was general support shown within the question around our priorities. And then as you start to drill down through that, I've got a separate slide for each priority that we'll work through. So the overall opposition was mentioned 95 times, but as you can see, there's things that are specifically mentioned in there. So there's themes the whole way through some of the questions, regardless of what the questions were asked. So not necessarily in opposition specifically to the priority, but to things that we're proposing in general. So the first priority is around mana whenua and council having a mutually mana enhancing partnership, of which there is strong support for that to happen, and a small amount of opposition. Secondly, our communities are resilient, safe, healthy, thriving and connected. Again, this is showing support around that priority. And I am just going to skip through some of those because we do have a lot to cover, but there will be opportunity for questions at the end. Third priority, our local economy is prosperous, again showing support. Fourth priority, our natural environment is restored as we transition to a low carbon future, and responses were started to dwindle as they went through each priority by the look of it. But for those that answered this specifically, supporting of this priority. And then lastly, people have access to suitable housing in Kapiti, and strong support. The housing one, the general opposition, you would have noticed is particularly they've made comments around thinking that it's a central government role rather than local council.
It's a section break.
Yeah.
Just an ask one for
Just, I guess, a funny little question. You mentioned that as the questions went down, the interest passes in terms of people responding to that question. Could we randomly mix them up? You know, like if the submission was done online, could that randomly be mixed up? So it changes the priority and then you actually get more intake?
Do you mean for next time? Or?
Yeah, or is it a possibility, or is that way too crazy?
That would be something we'd have to come back to you. Yeah, the way that we built the questions and engagement HQ actually took quite a lot of background work to make them flow as well as they did anyway. So adding another level of complexity to that, and again, it also comes back to the analysis at the end of it. But I guess as a note to that, the extension of that is some people did, as you would have seen, went in just to answer a specific question. So people really have chosen whether they're interested in everything or just one thing. So the way that it was set up enabled them to do that was the one reason that we wanted it to be like that.
I note, Alison, that you've said a couple of them had strong support and then just others had support, and I see that it's referenced further into the presentation as well. I'm just wondering what the ballpark is for strong support versus support. As in, is that just kind of a judgment thing? Should we just be making our own judgment, or is there, I don't know, keen to hear.
Yeah, and I guess, and that is my judgment. Yeah, so, everyone will look at it differently, I would suspect. So this is just to give you a feel for you to interpret with what you've read as well. Yeah.
It's really just a note that in the opposition to housing, some of that was driven by clear indication that people thought that we were actually going to be the housing provider, and that hasn't been picked up on this particular slide.
So one, I'm not sure if this is the reason, but it's probably worth noting that anything with less than 5 against it hasn't been included. So Jared's just provided the upper level of responses.
I think that's picked up in council's only role is to be an enabler.
Oh, fair enough.
Yeah, I just wanted to say while Jared's still here, and just while we're having a break, that I do think that these questions did provide us with more richness of feedback. This is my 5th long-term plan, as either a community board member or councillor, and I just think the feedback that we got, people were really thinking about issues that they may not have previously submitted on. There was one where we had 1,000 submissions saying build a dam, and that was kind of the other end of the scale. But I found that people were really thinking about the questions, and I just want to congratulate the team, because I think we've had some really valuable feedback about all our major issues through this process. Thanks.
Thank you. And I have to say, when we started reading them, it was actually quite a nice read, because we got meaningful engagement and people, as you said, had thought about what they were saying. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Alison. So our next section, investing for resilience and growth, which was questions around infrastructure and facilities. So our first slide of our pie charts, where we see on the left-hand side, we have the raw data, people that answered the question, the people that didn't answer the question. So people that said yes, people that said no, and people that didn't answer the question. On the right-hand side, the results have been modified where the not answered have been taken out. So I won't dwell on that too much. I'll get into the themes. So the question that we asked is, do you think investing for resilience and growth is the right approach for council to take at this time? So in terms of support, there were 328 themes of support arose from the submissions. Most of those, as we can see, were general support. There was some opposition. There was 141 themes of opposition. And if you have a look at that, a small amount was just general opposition. And some people actually, whilst they supported investment in infrastructure, they didn't support investment in growth. So they supported one or the other. So we can see that as you go through the list of the themes. And again, some questions or some thoughts around the gateway popped up. So I won't say strong support. I'll leave that for your judgment. But in terms of the key take out of this slide is that there were more themes of support for different reasons than opposition for this question. So in terms of a summary, so looking at that data, staff have made a recommendation to yourselves to consider and to debate and discuss, of course. So the question that was asked, the recommendation from staff is yes, council should invest for resilience and growth based on the submission responses that we've had. That's a section break, so happy to take questions.
Yeah, Mark, given my ignorance about the word resilience, how do you define it? I'm unsure what that word actually means. It's got more than seven letters, by the way.
Polysyllable.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Look, my definition of resilience is being robust, being able to recover from unforeseen events, being able to stand up against things that are thrown against you. When we talk about resilience in a local government perspective, it's being able to keep the lights on, keep the water going where it should be, providing water, making sure that we continue to provide the services of local government.
Can I just ask how this is going to work? Excuse me if I've missed it, but we've just had a recommendation of how we should respond to these. Are we going to then revisit all of those at the end and say whether we agree or not, or should we be doing that as we go along? Because I'm afraid that silence might be acquiescence otherwise.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Councillor. That is an excellent question. And look, as the Chief Executive said at the beginning, today the purpose of today's workshop is to get some steers. So what we do for our sections, we do have recommendations, and we would like you to discuss that. We would like you to debate it. We would like you to give us a steer and say yes, you accept that. What we geared up today is for the parking lot. If there's a recommendation that we can't necessarily get consensus on it, we'll park it. But it would be really helpful for us. In terms of where we're at in terms of presentation, these are sort of the less, if you will, contentious issues. But it would be fantastic to get a straw poll that you're happy with that recommendation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think that would be good.
Yes, certainly. My bad. I apologise for that. Mr. Mayor, through you, just noting that it is a public workshop. We know you can't vote on it, but it is just providing us with a straw poll and a clear steer.
I'm happy to get the ball rolling, so to speak. Look, I endorse that view. I think it's part of the core part of what councils have to do is ensure that we are resilient, and growth is supposed to be paying for growth. This is the way this council is addressing that issue. So I think the direction we're taking, and that's reflected in what's come back from the public in general. Yep, I'm happy with that.
I think the approach we're looking at is by exception, which means if you agree with the recommendation, then that's all right. If you disagree, then you raise the issue.
I don't disagree, I just have a question. And my question is around, so when this, or if this goes into the draft LTP for adoption, how will that look? Will it just say, council will be investing for resilience and growth because the community's told us it's the right approach? Well, like what kind of, I guess, supporting information or investment will there be underneath that, or how will that be categorised in the actual document itself?
So through you, Mr. Mayor. So that's an excellent question. So in terms of the covering report that seeks your approval for the long-term plan, we will be discussing the submission results and the questions and providing a steer. But just in terms of the investment and the resilience and the growth is really enabled or embedded in our financial strategy. It sits within our infrastructure strategy, our revenue and financing policy, our current budgets, which is driving a rates increase of 7.8%. So it wouldn't be at that level if we weren't saying let's invest in resilience and growth. So it's an excellent question, and we just need to obviously make that really clear in the report.
That question is for every other.
Yes, Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Jackson.
Your Worship, would it be seen as an umbrella under which we're going to be operating?
High level. Right, if there are no other issues, we are okay with that.
So that leads us really nicely into our financial and infrastructure strategies. So it's a very long question, but I'll read it anyway because it is really important, and I'll take you through it nice and slowly. So what we put in our consultation document questionnaire is councillors determined, and it really relates quite nicely to the councillor's previous question. Councillors determined that it is appropriate to change the limits for rates, capital spending and borrowing for the 2021-41 long-term plan, given the extra costs that need to be met and the challenges the district is facing, particularly to be able to replace vital infrastructure in the future. What do you think? So, of course, that question is really talking to, in terms of our financial strategy, we're proposing a step change to the financial strategy. We've increased or proposing and increased our upper limits on rates, our upper limit on our borrowing and our upper limit on our capex, and that's to invest in infrastructure and resilience. And the question we were really asking the community, are you happy with that? Are you happy with those levels of rates? Are you happy with the level of borrowing to enable us to do what we're proposing needs to be done for this district to get prepared? So in terms of the themes, so in terms of support, there was general support. Was 122 times we got support, and it was general support. So our takeout from that is people responded positively to the question and supported it. We then did get a large number actually saying, or large number of 234 themes actually pretty much opposed that question, or was a negative response to that question. And so it forced us to actually look at, well, what were the themes coming out there? And this is where this rich data has actually been really helpful. So, and what you can see is the 93 of those responses were just opposed to a rates increase. But that wasn't really the question. The question was, are you happy for the financial strategy limits to go up so that we can invest in the district? And we do see this, and we'll see it throughout the slides, that some of the submitters will quite often put a number of comments, no rates increases, no rates increases. And this is why this is themes, not responses. So people felt that we should reduce spending and keep within the current budget, and it sort of dwindled all the way down to focus on core infrastructure and services only. So part of the question is we need to increase our limits so we can actually invest in infrastructure. And one of the responses, we oppose that, but we want you to invest in infrastructure. In terms of ideas, there were lots of rich ideas, and you can see in the slide before you, a number of ideas came through, and a common theme came through is to invest in the airport. So whilst the slide actually, at first glance, you would say actually there was more opposition than support for this question, when we looked at the data, again, the responses to this question was, I don't support it because I'm opposed to the Kapiti Gateway. So we had to really sort of look at that information and go, well, what is it that you're opposing? And you're actually saying, no, don't increase rates, but please invest in infrastructure, which is why rates need to go up, which is why the upper limits need to go up, because we need the borrowings to go up. So in terms of the summary, and this is officer recommendations for you to discuss and debate and provide a steer. So again, the consultation question, I won't read that to you again. But what are we recommending? We're saying actually we've looked at the results, we've seen the opposition, we've delved into the themes behind that opposition. And our sense is actually it's not, people aren't saying don't change the financial strategy, stay constrained. They are saying invest in infrastructure. So in light of the fact that we've had, in the previous slide, we've actually had quite strong support, I won't say whether it's strong, but they've said yes, invest in resilience and infrastructure. So, and then when we ask about the financial strategy, it's no. So our recommendation to you is to invest in resilience and infrastructure. We need the financial strategy and the infrastructure strategy to enable that, and that's what is being proposed. So from us to you, we recommend that we actually continue with our proposed financial strategy and infrastructure strategy.
So by exception, Councillor Holbrook.
I've just got a wee comment to make through you, Mr. Chair, if that's okay. I'm just looking again at the question. I wonder if we highlighted rates too much, because actually the main point is the limits on our borrowing and to enable spending, and not carrying through the words growth, and well, we have infrastructure in here, but it's right at the end, you know, if you look at the pyramid. So maybe note for next time, just be careful about the use and placement of the word rates within a document like this, because it's always triggering, isn't it? But apart from that, I support what's on there.
Councillor Coates.
Yeah, look, mine's just a comment as well. So at your discretion, Mr. Mayor. What was interesting reading all of the submissions is the, if anecdotal is the word, but the richness. We talked about the richness of the information. So where you see someone say no or don't support or even support, and then put it into context with their view. So I've used one as an example. increase the commercial rate as well as increasing the residential rate by 225,000. It's actually not what we were saying. So what it says to me is that person doesn't actually, either through the information that we've provided or just their understanding of a rating system, doesn't actually understand what we're proposing, because that answer is actually in conflict with the very proposal itself. And then many of the other responses are, get central government to do that, or you should have used this money for that. We can't actually do that. So you have to take some of those answers into context with that they say this, but yet their feedback says this, and you can't actually, or it doesn't make sense even in some instances. So certainly when I've read it, that's the way that I've interpreted some of that stuff. It'd be nice if we could do that. And actually what we're suggesting through that last response is actually transferring more to the commercial sector rather than to the residential.
Is the Derek, when he said when you have open-ended questions, it can lead to this confusion.
I guess my point is, it's not saying that our ratepayers are not intelligent. It is a complex, I only know what I know from sitting around this table 2 days a week, sometimes more, over a number of years. It is many of these things are complex topics. And pre-funding, depreciation, unfunded depreciation. And so that comes through in a number of the submissions where actually people either haven't taken the time or don't understand. And so, there was one submission there where they said they'd spent 2 hours filling it out, and some people have taken the time, and there's some good quality submissions. But it does sometimes reflect in their response through the lack of knowledge or understanding of the actual question or topic.
Again, is by exception, you've got another comment.
Well, it'll get easier as we go along, because we're washing up a whole lot of general kind of comments, and I think this is kind of the opportunity to do that. So as I went through, I saw opportunities for education and communication. When all this washes up and we've managed to finally get the thing through, is it possible to go back through with another lens and say, okay, how can we use these comments to, like, nobody knows where their dog's thing, registration money goes. You'd think they'd know that after the dog bylaw, but can we do more in that space or in other spaces to, educate and communicate?
I suppose because this is a long-term plan, the first year is more set, the rest is indicative, so there's room for refining it. Councillor Holiday.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, and look, it's a very similar comment to Janet just washing some things out. Look, I'll freely admit, I'm challenged by rates. I'm challenged by the mechanism and the amounts and the ongoingness of it. And I've been told that the current system is a blunt instrument, and I'd also agree it's not fit for purpose. But we're going through local government reform very shortly, and I think that's going to give us the opportunity to address those issues. We've got the beast that we've got at the moment, as long as we're heading in the right direction, and we're prudent in how we do things as well. Then I think the opportunity to really shake this up hopefully is coming through that process, and around that, and I just felt I needed to get that out of my system.
My red light's on. I think that you're giving greater respect to the ratepayers than some of them deserve. I think James is right that it's a very complicated position where people don't see the relationship between one section of the document and the other section of the document. I think you have to take that into consideration.
Mr. Mayor, through you, I just wanted to respond to the Deputy Mayor's earlier question. Will we be using some of this feedback or this rich data to reflect on any improvements going forward? Absolutely. So you'll see a slide, I think it's about 69, about the rating system, where we've been told I think what's being echoed by the respondents or submitters is what we already know. Our rate system is complicated, and they want us to be more transparent. So we're absolutely lifting that data up, and we'll use that going forward. Just like anything, we do review our processes, look for improvements. So yes, we will be using this data. Just before we conclude, so it's a tick to the staff recommendation. Thank you very much.
Okay, so next we're going to work through the big issues that we identified and asked for general feedback. So other than responding to climate change, there weren't any yes/no questions. It was open-ended, so the responses are reflective of that. So the first one around COVID-19, we asked if there were particular things community would like to do, council to do in response. Is it the same things we did previously or other things? So there was generally positive feedback about maintaining the same level of involvement or response. Some opposition to council response, but again in the context of people considering it a central government responsibility, not local council. Mention of the rates increase. And then there were some improvements suggested. So just picking up on the question before, this is the sort of thing that we will absolutely note and carry forward into work programs or if there's a resurgence of COVID in the community. We asked, so some of the things around positives that have come out of the pandemic that we'd like us to keep doing or support. So around the positives around community and individual related benefits, particularly increased neighbourly support. So things that we all reflected on ourselves after lockdown and what we witnessed. And then some negatives, but there were some comments in there about council. What did council actually do anyway? So there were some quite differing views through the questions. Question around access to housing and if there were any views on access to housing generally. Noting that this was also a key decision, I think from some of the responses it showed that there was a bit of misinterpretation around the question and with this as opposed to the key decision question, and again around council actually doing rather than being the enabler. But generally the themes showed that there is support for council to be an enabler, and that breaking down to things like making more land available is the big one there, and then through to encourage smaller and higher density housing and streamlining building consents for building. There were some comments in opposition, again around being central government, and some comments around opposition to council providing social or council housing, and some ideas that came through around limiting environmental impacts and also to invest in infrastructure at pace with housing. So the specific questions in response to the climate change, so we asked, should we continue to prioritise emissions reduction within council? So 67% didn't answer the question, but of those that we did, 22% or 151 people have said yes, 70 people or 10% have said no, we shouldn't. And then the next slide is just a breakdown of the comments that followed after those specific responses. So the support theme came through 114 times, and then specific comments around only if reductions are significant or done in a cost-effective way. The opposition, those that weren't just generally opposed, was around the increasing in cost to do what we were proposing, and that people considered that there were more important priorities that needed urgent attention. Again, some ideas there about what council could do to continue to prioritise, and they'll be taking forward into the work program for further discussion with the team working on climate change program. Next question was, how do we ensure equity across the district? There were a number of comments around people that are affected on the coastline should have a higher rates increase for that, rather than it being a district-wide rate. And obviously talking about protecting public infrastructure rather than private housing. And the Paikakariki seawall was mentioned a number of times, and also obviously was a key decision, but came through here as well, and particularly around people talking about that there should be an alternative solution, and managed retreat was mentioned through some of the comments as well. And we specifically asked about the strategic framework, and if we think that, if the community thinks that we've got it right. 80% didn't answer this question, but of the ones that did, 74 or 11% have said yes, they did agree with the priorities, and 9% have said no. And then the next slide just breaks that down a bit further through to what the general support showed, and also people had the opportunity to raise particular concerns. So, for example, not enough focus on certain areas such as managed retreat or adaptation, should be focusing on reducing road travel and public transport, wanted the priorities to be more specific, and then there was through down to some ideas as well. Next big issue was around managing growth. As our district grows, what do you think good growth looks like? And interestingly, working through this, it was nice to see how much this aligns with the conversations that we've been having. So infrastructure is the top ranking one, through to housing, and then community, community, environment, and economic. So in that order came through in the themes. So there were some really interesting comments that came through in that as well. And what else can council do to help build community resilience? Again, infrastructure is the main focus, and the airport featured heavily in there as well, around being in people's opinion, being necessary in disaster or for medical emergency, and similar themes, so down to community, particularly around communication and consultation with the public and listening to our community, and then through to government's economic and housing and addressing housing availability. How can council encourage households' emergency preparedness? So particularly ideas around increased or better or more targeted communication and facilitating community plans.
I get a word in now, but just one slide. So look, we asked the question, should we explore different options for how we insure our assets? And look, the first key conclusion there is actually not many people answered the question. So
the fact that a lot of people didn't answer the question, can you tell us why it isn't?
Yes, certainly, Mr. Mayor. So in a section coming up, we will go into great detail about insurance. So it's one of the options that I will be talking to you about. And it was why we asked the question is obviously our insurance premiums are going through the roof. They have been going through the roof for the last 2 or 3 years, and they're going to continue to do so as Wellington is increasingly perceived as more and more risky. But I don't want to give my slides away, as I will talk to you about it. But the factor of the matter is insurance is an operating cost, and operating costs are funded by rates. So the more we're paying in insurance, the more our rates are going to go up, and which is why we asked it. So we asked the community, what do you think about insurance? Because we know that everyone will have home insurance and understands how expensive it is and how complicated it can get. So we're no different. Our insurance is probably far more complex. But of those that did answer, so the most important point here is not many people answered the question, but of those that did, a third actually said yes, explore further options, please. A third said self-insure, increase your deductibles, which is excesses, and so probably not. And then a small amount said reduce your cover, increase your excess. So all that will actually come into play in a section a little bit later on.
So the next two slides are around the central government changes, and the responses were actually quite similar. So the first one is, in particular, what's important for community about council's role, with a theme there, particularly around governance, going down into some of the details like Kapiti Coast District Council should maintain control, so specifically about the Three Water reform, through to people thinking that we should support government change, make sure that it's representative of community interests, ensuring cost effectiveness and maintaining infrastructure. The next key point was particularly around water quality and maintaining water quality and supply, and then just some general comments about council should be, I hadn't read that one before, council should be commended for its work to date. And then the next slide is just a similar thing.
Just before you go, I just need to ask the Chief Executive this question. On the council's role, governance here, KCDC should maintain control. I mean, that's a foolhardy response, right?
Yeah, I think it's important to just take it as a sentiment.
Yeah.
It's really, I think it dates all the way
We can
back
do
to,
jack all with that.
so yeah, but because we're asking them how they feel, I think it's important for us to go, okay, so a lot of people say control is important. We know, and we will discuss in future whether there is really control, depending on what the proposal looks like. But for now, to say that if we're listening to our community, some of them say that will remain important to me. How do we know our water will be in sort of local hands? It is it's not worth debating with them to say, okay, I hear you.
And then this slide was specifically asking about what we should advocate for, but very similar themes to the previous round, around governance and council's role, and through to water quality and infrastructure. So, in summary, with respect to COVID-19 response and recovery, we will continue with what we've been doing, but also noting the suggested improvements. Access to housing, there's a strong support for council to enable access to housing. Responding to climate, sorry, I used the word strong. Support. Responding to climate change, particularly around supporting for prioritising emissions reductions and general support for the strategic framework. Managing growth, those focus areas on infrastructure, housing, community, environment and economy, and strengthening our resilience with focus areas on infrastructure, community, and ideas noted for encouraging emergency preparedness. And with respect to government changes impacting council, just strong focus on governance.
Can I just ask, we are happy with the staff feedback on those?
Sorry, just one thing.
Councillor Hampton.
Just one thing under the responding to climate change, the general support for the strategic framework. We heard quite strongly from Ngāhapua Ōtaki around the Treaty House model and the need to incorporate that further. I'm just wondering what opportunities there are to make any changes to that before next week, or whether there's, I don't know, scope to to, yeah, I don't know, who's the best person to answer that?
Councillor Randall's got his microphone on, so
No, I want to ask a question.
Yeah, but hold on.
we want to answer a question first. Councillor, we'll get you next.
I might make a comment about our partnership approach overall and then hand over to Sean to talk specifically about it in relation to climate. But exploration of the Treaty House model and what that means for us in our ongoing partnership with iwi will form a part of our partnership conversations with iwi over the next few months, but that's not entirely the question that you asked. So I'll hand over to Sean to answer that part.
Well, I would have thought that model then would sit over the top of all of those areas of work, so there's probably a better mechanism to incorporate that view than just within one individual document.
Councillor Randall.
Yeah, thank you. No, it's about the strong support for council to enable access to housing. Now, it was quite clear from the survey that the public don't mind the council, maybe removing zoning requirements, more access for developers to develop housing. It is not a question that the council itself should be involved in buying land for housing. So that's how I read the question from the members of the public. So can I have a comment from someone on that, please? What's the word enable mean?
I suspect some councillors would quite like to get into debate over that topic, councillor, and that might be for the 24th, because I think we've heard a slightly different take on it from others around the table and from our analysis, which is enable is slightly less than be the developer. And people have, what I think I've seen is people drawing quite a distinction between the council taking on development risk from the council doing what it can do to enable more houses to be built. So I would say that actually, in my view, there is quite strong support for the word enable as people understand it. And that is not to say that we use this to drive exactly how we do things, but that will include freeing up more land and anything else we have identified that might help in the regulatory space and making things happen faster and cheaper. For example, incentivising smaller dwellings that are more intensely located, incentivising that is something that people would want to see. In terms of your specific comment about owning land, we've actually said we're going to do a little bit in that space. We haven't had any pushback on it. We didn't highlight it as a main area. Anything that we do, as you've heard me say repeatedly, will be very small and symbolic, and will focus on where we can make a difference in communities in the affordable space. Those decisions would still come forward to you as part of an ongoing, annual process. When we say we would like to do this, would you agree? And you get the opportunity to say yes or no to that.
Councillor Holborough, then Councillor Mecca.
Thank you, Mr. Chief Executive. I'm just wondering, what do you mean we'll be debating this on the 24th? Is there a specific paper on housing? Because I understand that now is the time when we're meant to be giving a steer rather than on the 24th.
Thank you, Councillor. So on the 24th is when you will approve the paper with all the decisions that make up the LTP. So I guess I'm generalising when I say in adopting that paper, you will have a chance to speak to your view of what you've liked or not liked about it. And that'll be what we would call debate.
Yeah.
So, sorry, yes, I want to stress the point which you have reminded me of. I wouldn't want to give people the impression that on the 24th you'll make different decisions. You'll make those decisions then. We need a really clear steer today about the direction of travel for all of these key points, as we've explained, so that we can prepare the documents and have them ready to go on that date.
Or rectify things early next week. Councillor Mecca.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor. It's an interesting point that Councillor Randall raises, and I'd like to agree with the CE again on record. That being an enabler is it's a wide term, and one of those areas is being able to create templates and demonstrate what is potentially possible and what's not happening in the region. So I think Councillor Randall's quite right. There's a sentiment coming through that they don't want KCDC to become the landlord and the social provider of housing, and I don't know that there's been any suggestion that we would. But it's worth noting that opposition, but also that the enabler can be a little bit wider than what some people think, and that can mean that we need to demonstrate what good housing practices are like, and that means getting our hands a little bit more dirty from time to time.
Thank you. So just double checking that the LTP workshop on the 1st of June is not going ahead now?
Sorry, Councillor, you were slightly late in.
Yeah, oh, sorry.
No, we are really keen to try and finish today through all of this paper. We have committed, though, that we will come back on Tuesday. We may have to come back because we haven't finished today. We will definitely come back because we want to allow you a couple of days of reflection on where we've got to. We'll land it back in front of you and say, this is where we've got to. You've got your final chance for any discussion, and then after that, we're pretty committed.
Okay, so just a second question. So decisions that we're making are not only as proposed in the LTP, but also any reprioritisation of budget from the previous LTP. Should we need to do that? If that's correct, this will be the time to do it.
If it was anything material, we have probably missed that opportunity. As I said at the outset, the feedback we've had through this process has not indicated a need to change direction of the supertanker. So it really comes down to materiality. If people want to propose small changes, our likely response will be, well, it's in the work program, so you don't need to say that today. If you wanted to divert money from one activity to another, we'd have to come back to you most likely on Tuesday with our advice on that, if it was something we haven't already contemplated.
No other issues raised. I think general agreement on the staff feedback on this one.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
So the next section is key decisions, but just before we go there, I'm just conscious that Jared's here. So, but it feels like we've got a good understanding of the analysis and how we've brought everything together. So, rather than me requiring him to be here for another hour, if there's no further.
You get paid by the hour.
We're trying to get rates down.
I was being more subtle.
Thank you. So I did actually have a question for Jared, and I wasn't sure if he was going to be here for when the particular topic came up, and that was in relation to the Paekakariki seawall. So there's been a number of comments made around, having the data and then having those open questions, and I suppose this topic has probably raised some concerns with me in terms of I suppose, to me, it's about predicting what some of those questions' outcomes might be. And so the answers there are either yes, proceed, continue with the $28 million, or reduce it. But there's not actually an option to say don't proceed at all, where there's a lot of comments made about how they don't want to have a seawall as well. And those people haven't been able to provide their answer in terms of the quantitative results, and that topic has got about 40% of people who haven't responded, and I don't know whether that's because there wasn't an answer they could respond to, because I know there was one person who said that they didn't want to proceed, but then they said no, but at a lesser amount. So it's about framing the questions, quantitative questions, based on sort of what the public opinion is out there, which has been reflected in these in this poll or the survey.
It's not a poll. So under the Local Government Act, when we ask significant questions, we are required to provide all reasonably practicable options. And Sean may wish to expand, but what I would say to you as clearly as I possibly can is to not do something is not considered to be an option from a risk perspective, from our perspective at this time. To do nothing, there is no alternative that we could do. And if that seawall fails in the next big storm, you will see us doing stuff. Because to have that road disappear and houses not have access and to lose infrastructure is not an option for us. So I don't know if you want to expand on it, Sean, but we legitimately said there are really two options, a higher cost and a lower cost.
So it's not, that question is not for you people, it's not for Jared.
Great. Thank you, Jared.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The only thing I'd add is that current policy is that we protect public assets. So if you were going to step outside of that, again, as the Chief Executive's reference, then that would be a significant departure from both policy and the LTP process, I guess.
Okay,
Mr. Chair, I have another follow-up question.
What is it?
So is not managed retreat an option?
Not if you followed coastal hazards over the last 8 years in this district, no.
Okay.
So you cannot, what the courts told us very clearly is you cannot make that decision without consulting properly with your community and giving them options which range from defend to retreat. And what the council did back in 2012 was it decided to do managed retreat as a policy without having consulted first. So that is exactly the work that's going on right now, is to do that consultation before you make those decisions. And you cannot anticipate that with an infrastructure decision.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, following up from what the Chief Executive just said, the feedback we got, and if my memory is correct, even the low carbon and I think a former mayor all presented in their submissions to have an alternative rather than the two viewpoints that Mr. Mellon has presented, that we look at alternative, the alternative models. Through a lot of the submissions talked about alternative models. They didn't agree with a wooden seawall, or they didn't agree with a metal, if you like, seawall. They wanted an alternative. That was clear.
Yeah, and as Mr. Mellon's explained a few times to this table and over probably 5 years now, the design process went through all of those options. Sometimes what you're hearing is simply people saying, and I didn't like the answer. Sometimes it is that they have just discovered new options, and the answer we can give you is they have been worked through. So that's a long process that a lot of people have had input into and will continue to. It is perfectly legitimate for people to do exactly as they did. However, we do believe we have the answer to all of that, and it's sometimes makes us probably go and scream in a cupboard or bang our head on a brick wall because, unfortunately, you don't get everyone's attention at the same time to explain these things to them. We would love to have been able to do that. We will continue to have to do that.
I will just add, if you would like, I can make available the consent application for the concrete wall. Actually have a whole lot of detail in there around alternatives. All the information is available. If you'd like it, I can forward it to you, Councillor.
But I wouldn't be able to understand it. But I do think peer review. Can I ask you, do you carry out peer reviews in some of these larger structures?
Yes. So that there were multiple peer reviews on options associated with the seawall in Paikakariki, and we do, as of course, with anything of that scale, look to have that peer review as well.
Can we sort the key project one on the housing first, and we'll move on to the next one?
Okay, so key decision one was, should council take a bigger role in housing? And as you can see by the pie graphs in front of you, 230 people didn't answer the question, but of those that did, 251 or 37.5% have said yes, or 28.2% have said no. The next slide goes a bit more into the analysis. So as well as being able to select yes or no, there was an opportunity to provide further comment, and that's what this is showing, the themes that have come through there. So that support around council's role as an enabler and then specific themes such as making more land available, allowing for smaller or high density or infill housing, and desire for partnership with central government or developers or others. And some have talked about partner with mana whenua. And then in the comments that were opposing this, again, it's the theme around housing as a central government or NGO responsibility, and council should focus on core infrastructure and services only, and some have made a comment about opposing to using rates for housing. So we're going to go through each key decision and then there'll be a summary at the end. So the second one is, should we renew the Paikokariki seawall a different way? 35, nearly 36% of responders to this question have said yes, and 49 or nearly 50% didn't answer, and 14.6% have said no. Again, they had the opportunity to provide further comment to the yes or no question, so it's really just going into a bit more detail around the supporting timber or concrete and support for a seawall replacement without a particular option, and some comments around shouldn't it be funded by ratepayers, which is a similar theme that we've seen previously around particularly the homes that would be seen to be benefit from seawall replacement should have the higher rate. And then opposition is the themes around different option and that managed retreat conversation that we've just spoken about, and then just particular comment about needing to consult with local iwi and community. Next is the question of should we set up a council-controlled organisation. 38.7% of responders have said yes, and 30% of those that answer the question have said no. Further breakdown on the next slide, people have drawn a conclusion that to use the CCO as a means to play a role in the airport, and also showing support for a second income stream or lower rates, and to ensure that it's cost effective or independent of rates is another theme. From the opposition, the general opposition, and then drilled down a bit more into not seeing it as a core business that council should do. Council shouldn't take on commercial activities, and I think it's partly showing that there was coming through in some of the comments that in some cases there wasn't an understanding of a CCO role or function, and just some general comments about needing more information and more consultation. But as it was described in the consultation document, if we do go ahead with a CCO, when we get to the stage of looking at what could be in the CCO, that's another consultation process separate to this. And lastly, should council explore ways to have a role in the airport? So of the people that responded to this question, nearly 56% have said yes, and 20% have said no. And then next slide is showing the themes or rationale behind those answers, particularly in support around, it's important for Kapiti with regards to economic assets, transport or infrastructure, seem to be important for emergencies and resilience. There was a lot of general support, and also some have made the comment support, but with central government support as well. The opposition themes were the highest level of that was around general opposition, and then dropping down into not seeing it as a core business or within scope or level of expertise for council. Some people were of the view it doesn't generate an income, or the costs are too high. There was a theme around using the land to build houses, and some specific ideas around the role of iwi and the discussion that you've likely seen around local iwi should be given the land, but then also thinking about joint ownership between council and iwi and more consultation needed with local iwi. So in summary, that is Mark has been describing as we've been going through, this is staff recommendation and the opportunity for further discussion from councillors, but staff recommendation is for each of the key decisions that yes, we should continue with those proposals based on submission responses.
Councillor Coates.
So the first one's on the seawall. The feedback that I heard and that I read was, for those that, many of them that said yes, was including the designs from the original discussion. So could we just clarify with Sean whether that is, my understanding is that that was discussed and that is possible, that if it's the cheaper solution, it still has attributes from the more expensive design?
Yes, so the elements there that reflect number of access points, the key objectives of the shared path, the cultural or artwork that was proposed to be included in the original proposal, yes. The intention was to incorporate those into the proposed timber option. The main point of difference was primarily the lower walkway. That is not part of the current like-for-like replacement, if you like, for the timber, but it would incorporate those other elements. We would clarify that, I guess, through the next stages of potentially the document, or make that information available. But I have, I think I provided an update both to the submitters, or one of the submitters, on that we would incorporate those elements, and we will also be using a lot of the design work that was done on the concrete option is still useful in terms of the geotech work there, the survey work, and a lot of other stuff we can continue to make use of for the timber option.
So to follow up, or a second one on the same topic and then a separate question on a different topic. So we also had, I think I'm allowed to say this, in terms of the briefing around the coastal work, and the question that I posed in there was around how that work reflected any decision we might signal today around the seawall. So how does that align up in terms of, you know, should it, from an elected member's perspective, affect any way that we make that decision based on the lifetime of either proposal and the design?
So I think the underlying, I guess the coastal assessment work that we're proposing as part of the coastal hazards project is broken down into, I think it was 4 areas of focus in terms of time frame. So the 30-year time frame, I think it was a 30, 50, 70 and 100. So the design life that we are suggesting for the timber option would align very well with the 30-year time frame, where we will be looking at what the coast might look like based on climate change associated with that 30-year option. So by going for that timber option, that also aligns you with potentially what you might be doing in other areas of the coast on that 30-year horizon with regard to the rest of our infrastructure that protects public assets in that space. Because the majority of that is timber, as was raised this morning, and that, again, is within the design life of those particular assets, that 30-year window.
Just hang on, James. I think it would be useful to take it topic by topic in terms of questions, simply because the questions that you raise will be fresh in your mind when you approach the first topic as to whether we give Council's recommendation a tick-off. So can we just go back to the first one? Should Council take a bigger role in housing? Any questions on that? Question on the first one?
No, it's about the bottom 2.
Okay, then you wait until then that time. Anybody questions on the first one?
Should we take a bigger role? The biggest role? Got the question.
Councillor Randall, you got a question on housing?
I don't usually agree with the Chief Executive on many things, but his answer on a bigger role in housing, his definition is what I support. I think this question is just too vague. You know, should council take a bigger role in housing? But the way it was explained by the Chief Executive, I think is the correct approach. But this is just too open-ended.
Councillor Holbrook.
Yes, I was just going to say that about this and some of the others too, which was touched on by James about the seawall. But in housing, Councillor McCann has already identified that quite a lot of people misunderstood the extent that we were going to be involved. What does enabling mean? I'm just wondering what level of detail are we going to go into so people understand what we've committed to in the final document. And I wonder if that's something that we could maybe workshop on Tuesday. Could agree in principle and then agree some broad kind of clarifications around that. Otherwise, a bigger role in housing, what do we mean?
That's way too big for us to cover off by Tuesday, technically. What I think we can do is we can recap on the sorts of things that are in the budget and what they are likely to be able to do. Some of the things that we're talking about, for example, are in the work plan, which is budgeted. So, for example, district plan changes. As you know, there's a little bit of money in there for acquisition of land and housing-related sort of work. A lot of this still depends on actions to be undertaken in terms of the housing needs assessment and a lot of work to come. So I think I think it would be quite problematic and premature to say exactly what it is and isn't, but I'd be very happy if we had a little bit of a conversation about the sorts of things we're talking about and what we will be coming to you to seek an answer as to whether you see that as in or out of scope. Because it is a little bit wide. Everything is possible, and I think, as I said before, and I'm grateful to Councillor Randall, that you know, if we did get our clear steer, is don't take development risk, and that's really good to know. We wouldn't have recommended it anyway. Do look hard at freeing up a whole lot of land so that more housing can be built. Do partner with people. Now, what does partner mean? So I think personally it is still quite open. I do think that we do not have the resources to be everything for all parties. So we're going to maximise what we do have. So back to what I said at the beginning, if you were comfortable that we brought you a bit of an idea on Tuesday as to the things that are in it, I don't know if Natasha or anyone wants to add anything today. I really wouldn't want to get into a big conversation about what's in or out of scope. I think that's part of the work programme.
Yeah, I mean, even identifying the kinds of conversations we're going to be having about it would be useful.
Councillor McCann.
I take on board what everyone's saying, and we have a work program that we've agreed some aspects to that we prioritised, and then a whole lot that are further down the train. I think what people are concerned about is whether we suddenly become a housing provider, and there really hasn't been any suggestion from anybody within council staff or the portfolio leader that that is the role we're taking. So there should be some clear comfort given to the people who are opposing the housing that is one of their main reasons that being it, that we're not going down that road. I would like at this opportunity to recognise some concerns around housing in the program, and that one of my main concerns is our capacity in the regulatory area and policy development area to actually deliver on what we need to. And those things, the CE has identified that there are increases potentially in the budgets, though we don't know quite where they'll lead to. But there are a significant number of factors that actually worry me about the delivery of this and whether we have the capacity. I could go on and on, but I don't think the Mayor wants me to.
Councillor Compton.
Just picking up on a couple of points from the discussions that we've had so far. I guess if the role we take in housing going forward after this could in part be something that gets addressed through the CCO when we come to consulting on a possible role for that. That could be that sort of vehicle that we looked at for that. So I guess it sets the scene for us going off and figuring out what those other things are in line with what's in the work program and seeing what other, I guess, levers might come out of the fact that we get this mandate to go off and do more things, if that makes sense. So we could do a lot more. Who knows?
I suppose it is just what Councillor Randall is simply saying is bigger role, just that one area is knocking off that we become developers. I think that's the main concern around that. The bigger role is yet to be explored in a number of areas, and just saying that the work program will define that. But how do we word it in the final document that enables us to frame it much more tighter? That's about it. Councillor Holbrook.
It's Gary.
Mr. Mayor, wouldn't a better way of framing it in your document be to state that you've made no provision in your long-term plan financially that would allow you to become an active developer or provider of housing? What you've done is you've made a provision to facilitate others to develop housing by changes to your district plan and your regulatory process and all the rest of it. But you have constrained yourself from going further by simply not providing financially to be able to do that. Now, if you were to be clear about that, all of those people that have an underlying suspicion that you're going to turn into another Caris would immediately see that that isn't the case because you have no capacity to do it, even if you wanted to.
If I may, yes, thank you, Mr. Simpson. We'll probably dial it back slightly from that because I think what it is left open is my sense would be, for example, in older person's housing, people have actually said you could do more there. That's not the same as affordable housing and housing across the spectrum. But I would be cautious that if we were too absolute in saying we are not going to build more houses, that's not 100% what I sensed from feedback, and it is part of the work program that we will want to come back to you and say, if people have said we should expand our portfolio of older persons housing, what might that look like? I personally would say we got somewhat of a cautious yes to that notion through this. It wasn't a major question that we drew out, but if you remember what I've kept saying to some of your frustration in the last 3 to 6 years is our standing mandate is no change to our portfolio. So that is one example where I now think we've opened the door to looking at a change in that portfolio, looking at utilising our land and our assets better where we can, and potentially out of that ending up with a slightly bigger stock of older persons or whatever description we might apply to that housing in future. So I'm just being a little bit cautious that we won't be too absolute and put obstacles in our own way.
So look, my problem is this. We've got that staff recommendation, and the wording that we consulted on is a bigger role in housing. I think I'm largely comfortable with that. The only thing is whether the staff can come back with an additional wording that you test us on Tuesday that will frame it better.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, that's what we will attempt to do.
Right. Still on the housing, Councillor Pravanov.
Okay, thank you. So maybe following on Mr. Simpson's question, maybe it might be useful to make some comments around whether or not our assets we're going to expand, whether there's going to be any land purchases or how we're actually going to frame it. I think those are the sorts of questions that members of the public are actually quite interested in.
Okay, thank you for that. So I think we can give staff a tick off here. Tuesday, we'll get a little more addition on this matter. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. Councillor Elliott, is it still on the housing?
Yes, and just as to what Jocelyn said, also could we have a steer on it as to whether or not we're going to sell off as opposed to get more assets in housing? That would be interesting to have some feedback on whether or not that's part of the plan.
Chief Executive.
So broadly speaking, no, we're not going to be, again, we're not going to be that definitive. We're going to say, that what we're going to do with housing will include looking at our older person's portfolio and whether it's fit for purpose and whether we need to do more in that space. And part of that, through our work program, when we bring you a piece of work on that, all of those will be considerations. I think they need to be. Are they the right houses in the right space? Can we do it better, differently? That'll all be part of the consideration. But again, that's the work program. You've given us an okay to look into that, I hope, and that's what we'll do. And that'll come through in the next sort of 6-12 months.
Okay, so that's a tick off with the proviso that Tuesdays will be a bit more work done. Next one. James, you've already asked a couple of questions.
My next question was on CCO, so if there's anyone I'd like to do.
Councillor Hansford on the seawall.
It's kind of a similar question to some of the questions that have been raised before, but I'd like to ask it specific to this one. In the kind of next phase of the process on Tuesday, when stuff's brought back to us, I'd just like to make sure that it doesn't just say, should we renew the Paikiri seawall a different way? Yes, we should renew it like for like, because as we heard from the design group, there's probably a way of, as James has been saying, building a timber wall, but so it's not just like for like, that straight timber, that those key elements from the original concrete design are upheld. So just wanting to make sure that it doesn't just say like for like, yeah, because we've heard very strongly that even the integrity behind it's there, but just the wording so that it shows that probably needs to be there.
Sorry if I may, I'm worried that it's starting to sound like we're going to give you the draft document on Tuesday, which we can't do. So we're flat out writing. Point I want to make is we've heard the comments on the housing and what it needs to say, hearing the comments on the seawall and what it needs to say. If we can give you a steer on Tuesday, it's the sorts of things to say, yes, we've heard you. We won't give you the actual words probably, if that's okay. That'll take a little bit longer. We are drafting flat out. So,
Councillor Holbrook.
I mean, if we're really not wanting to support the staff recommendation, when do we get to say that? Now, I know I'd like to go for the one that was originally consulted on. That's my personal preference after hearing all the submissions.
Thank you. So basically, this here is we're making our decision on or our giving you a steer or everyone a steer on based on our submission responses. So it's quite clear that there are a number of people who have talked about managed retreat, and so maybe when this is framed up, there is something about that is added in there further down the line, because we've had lots of conversations around that, and I'm talking towards the end of the time frame as an option for people to think about. Thank you.
Next one. Question for council control organisations. Councillor Coates.
So with this one, I'm not being nitpicky about the staff responses, but for me reading this was a conditional yes from submitters. It wasn't just a yes based on submission responses. Many of those were kind of conditional. Certainly also in the absence of further information, which I get that, and we around the table sort of get that to a degree. I'm happy to support this today, but I think certainly publicly and in any of the way that we communicate it, it's important that it was a conditional yes. It is interesting to note from the submitter feedback that many of them didn't, whether they didn't read the document, which admittedly it was lengthy, or understand it properly. It said that if we were to do anything, we'd further consult with the community. That part was missed by many. So for me, this was a conditional yes based on the responses.
Councillor Elliott.
I asked on Monday, I think, if we could possibly have those figures redone without what appeared to be the pro forma forms, possibly from, say, the Kapiti Airport, that only answered these two questions, this one and the airport question, said yes to both, and then had the same statements, lengthy summary statement and the same statements. There were about three sets of paragraphs throughout the document. Were those stats ever done with those removed so that we could have that today to consider? Because I think that those forms, wherever they came from, really skewered the results and the figures on CCO and airport.
So I did speak to Jared about that, because even though it was on a pro forma, it's still an individual person's response. So they've taken the opportunity to not write it themselves or for whatever reason. And so in addition to the report that you've got today, there's a further more in-depth report coming from Public Voice that actually has a bit more of the narrative around what you've seen. And so Jared's response was generally with this type of pro forma response. In the text that you'll see in the next report, it will say X number of pro formas were received alongside X number of individuals. So there wasn't a desire to pull them out in the way that was requested, because there's still individual responses that we've had from people.
Okay, so when do we get those figures for that next report from Public Voice?
It was originally due the end of this week, but it's likely to be next week because we've focused so much on getting everything ready for today. Yeah.
Councillor Compton.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Councillor Coote said around it being a conditional yes, in terms of people are like, yes, set one up, but actually it's that consulting with the community about what you wanted to do. So I think that's one thing that needs to be made really clear when this comes back for the final vote, is that it's really clear that we are going to consult with the community about what we'd want this to do. Because I think that was the main fear, is that it would get set up and it could go and do everything. But I think people are willing to have a look at what the options are. And I think that's a good thing, that's a prudent thing from our community, and also from us that we've been upfront about that as well. Because I know we mention it in the consultation document that we will consult, but I can sort of appreciate that 100 odd pages people will skip over a little detail like that. So yeah, I think if we can just emphasise that to reassure people would be good.
Councillor McCann.
Just echo what my previous councillors Coots and Compton have said. I was going to say the same thing.
Just one observation from me, if I may. What I have found really interesting, though, is by asking a fairly generic question, some of the thoughtful submissions that we've received have flagged up a whole lot of interesting ideas. And that's what I've enjoyed about it is, yes, I know it was a kind of an oddity in that it wasn't specifically for one purpose or another. If it had been, we wouldn't have had that, I don't think. So no matter what happens, I have found that to be a useful process and a useful, some really interesting and useful responses.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I agree with what Councillor Compton has said, and I'd like to go one step further. I mean, I'm very negative about council-controlled organisations at the moment. That's all I want to say.
So am I reading it right that it's a tick, but the issue of the conditional, which was mentioned in the consultation document, but needs to be emphasised. Okay. Next one.
If I may, Mr Mayor, thank you. Just in regard to the conversation that's been taking place around conditional responses and the information that goes through the LTP, I just thought it might be useful just to talk through a little bit of the approach that we will be taking around wrapping up the result of the long-term plan. So, yes, there'll be narrative in the actual document, and we'll be able to bring back our thoughts around what that's going to look like on Tuesday, but not the actual test, because as Wayne said, we're still writing it. But in addition, what the intention is, so the question booklet that I've handed out, we're going to do something similar in a response format. So there'll be a response under each question about what the decision was from council and where appropriate why. So particularly in the key decisions, we'll say, you know, if it is adopted as being a CCO, then yes, it'll be a CCO. These are the types of things, and it can go into more information. So the long-term plan document is itself, if we tried to answer all these things in there, we'd be having a huge document that people possibly wouldn't read, whereas doing an answer booklet will give a lot of the responses that people have been looking through for the consultation as well.
Councillor Elliott.
Can I ask if there seemed to be a bit of confusion about whether or not it's the airport or the airport land. So what does that mean? Should council explore ways to have a role in the airport as an operational or the airport land? And yeah, that's just how confusing it was to have that open-ended question.
Well, one question, but if you read the commentary, it said, what we think we're hearing from the community is that the airport as an activity, planes taking off, is important to this district. Do you agree? And do you think we should look at a role in it, given for private sector people it doesn't really stack up as a viable operation? So I think it is the airport, but then it is what comes with it in order for it to function. So, for example, all of that land was acquired under the Public Works Act in order to support and run an airport. So it's not directly related, and it wasn't meant to be into that level of detail, simply because it's not our asset. It's simply reflecting what we think we're hearing from the community and asking them whether that's actually what they meant.
Support this recommendation.
Councillor Compton.
All right, just drop it so Jackie could come up there. I guess one of my concerns around this is that there's been there's lots of snippets of well-intentioned but not necessarily well-informed discussion about this, and that's something I think that came through in the submissions we had on this. And I sort of note that at one point we actually had sort of Silicon Valley dust being sprinkled around the room, and I just see today that Merlin Labs are going to be testing their planes at the Mojave Spaceport, which is been subsidised to the tune of about $300 million over the years. So I think we just need to be very careful about that sort of magic dust being sprinkled around. But I would say that one of the things I think I'd like to see explored, if we go down this thing of exploring a role in the airport, is, and the CEO sort of mentioned some wording there, which I thought was good, is around that activity of an airport, and that I would suggest that it doesn't necessarily have to be where it is, because that's a site that's limited on both ends in terms of its runway length. I think we should actually be open to the idea of, is there another place in the district where it could be located? Because Whangarei District Council at the moment is looking at relocating their airport for that very reason. So I think we should look at the options that can be explored through this with the current site, but I think as part of that we should actually look at the idea of, is that the right site for that longer term thing? Because people have said they want us to have more connections to the other part of the country. They want it to be able to offer those the different types of aviation there. People have talked about its role in disaster recovery, which would need a airport in a more resilient location with better facilities around it potentially to do. So I'd say my support for this is conditional on us actually having a look at those possible options, that if we can't retain it on the current site, that we actually explore what could be the options of relocating it, because it's not out of the question to relocate an airport. I saw one suggestion in there was suggesting north of Waikanae, and you could connect it to the train network if you extended that north, and I can promise you it wasn't me who said that in. That would be a great reason to extend the trains. But I think that's because I'm worried about this could be a giant black hole of money going in the way of a subsidy to a private organisation, whereas I think if that can't pan out, because as has been mentioned and is mentioned in the consultation document, it is a private asset, and they could close it tomorrow if they wanted, and we'd be very limited in what we could do until it came to a rezoning decision. So I think, making sure that we're looking at all those options around air services in the district would be what I'd like to see coming out of that exploring roles in this. Because I don't think it necessarily is limited to where the Royal New Zealand Air Force decided they wanted a wartime airfield in the 1930s. I think we can probably set our ambitions a bit higher if we want to have that sort of that bigger air commercial hub here that could actually genuinely act as an alternative to Wellington, because it is limited in what it could actually handle from Wellington at the moment. So I guess, that's my sort of conditional support for this. And I guess the challenge is if it can't work out to save the current site, to have that open-ended bit to say, actually, could we potentially do more in that space going forward? And obviously that would need government partnership and whatnot.
Councillor Hanford.
I'm probably of a similar mind to Councillor Elliott at the moment, just in terms of the way I feel the question's been interpreted, but instead kind of my interpretation of it being that Council could and, in my view, should play a role in the future of the airport land and enabling Hapu's vision and aspirations of that land. And also, you know, our climate response and housing, our housing needs, all of those kinds of things. So if we're taking the question as should council play a role in the airport and the operations of the airport, as you've tried to tease out, Jackie, thank you for that, then I feel, yeah, I would be of the same mind. So.
Councillor Holbrook.
We could try and reinterpret the question, but I think the question we've asked is should we explore having a role in this airport as an airport? I think that's what we've asked. We haven't asked about land acquisition or partnering with government or that kind of thing. But to me, having said that, I'm consoled by the explore, because I think that leaves it wide open for us to, I don't think we're hamstrung by this question. I think we should be quite clear about the question that we intended to ask and and what people probably thought we were asking. But by the same token, we are leaving ourselves open with this. I don't have a problem with it because we can always decide not to later. We're just exploring it.
Councillor McCann.
While I'm of the mind to agree with Councillor Hanford, I think one of the things we have to note here is what this consultation has thrown at us, which is very clear support that we should explore it. That, however, doesn't mean that we move forward with trying to hold on to an airport as an entity. It just means explore it. This is the question I think we all discussed about the vagueness of what does this actually mean and what are the potential options, because I don't understand what the solutions are, and I still don't. That does worry me as a councillor, not being able to figure out what the end game is.
Councillor Coates.
Might as well have a crack, given that everyone else is. Look, I mean, from day one, even I've said that the airport isn't viable as a standalone airport. I don't think many people disagree with that as just as an airport in terms of the planes flying, taking off and landing. The discussion, though, is around exploring. The wording isn't should council buy the airport. And so, again, I'm more comfortable, and the feedback certainly indicates that we have a role on behalf of our community to explore what that looks like. The other thing that I've said is it's privately owned, as Councillor Compton has said. We can explore all we want, but at the end of the day, if the private property owners don't want a bar of it, it's up to them because it's privately owned. So there is a caveat on this, and that caveat is by the owners. So I support us exploring, looking at ways to have a role in that discussion, what that looks like. Like Councillor McCann, I have some ideas, but no concrete ideas around what that could look like. It's always challenged me around the opportunity on the land, the rental income from the commercial sites and how that offsets the cost of the airport. That's more of a social discussion rather than a business discussion when we look at it from a council perspective. So I'm supportive, but also mindful of the feedback from the community. They weren't saying council should buy an airport and at great cost to the ratepayers, and I don't think the chief executive wants that either. So.
Councillor Holliday.
I guess out of the conversation I had, I would be endorsing Councillor Compton's view. And I did feel at the time, and I voiced it back then as well, I found the questions quite leading with regards to an outcome. After saying that, though, I think that's been part of the issue, has been a lack of information. We've heard certain sides of things, and I think there's a heck of a lot more information to come down and to be presented to all parties in regards to where this is all going to go. So I'm prepared to keep an open mind and explore all sorts of different options, but I am very cognizant of the fact that it is a privately owned space, and that does and will limit the options, and I think it's important that good, clean information is supplied to the community in an ongoing way around what is factual about the situation.
Councillor Buswell.
I agree with Councillor Holbrook and Councillor Coates in terms of the question, and I guess it's given us I mean, we've had a steer from our community that they were interested in the airport, hence the question, and it's given us a flavour of what they desire, and so going to explore these options that they've outlined, I think is quite prudent, and I think it's quite good to represent our community and the interests that they have.
Anybody else? Jackson.
I was just thinking, if it was turned round the other way and we lost the airport, can you imagine the criticism that we would have as a council for not doing anything?
Yeah, okay. Look, I think the key word is explore. And thank you, Janet, for pointing that out quite clearly. For me, it's a bit like the CCO. The CCO is a tool. It's when we apply it for any specific use of it, we do the consultation. In this case, the public has already told us, look, they agree that we should explore this. And as Councillor Compton has said, the exploration can range in whole areas, including some people saying we could go to another place. That's also an option. So explore for me is to have an open mind in this area, plus the fact that we have no choice because we are linked to whatever is going to happen there because we are the consenting regulatory body. So we have no choice in this matter. So I think this is a prudent position to take, that we will explore a role in the airport and keeping an open mind. Councillor Elliott.
Look, Sophie, Angel and I spent a good couple of hours with 5 or 6 of the Templeton people on Monday, was it Monday? Tuesday. And one thing that we kind of all came to the same conclusion and said to them was that they've really got to start telling their story and talking to the public themselves and not relying on third parties to tell their story. And we felt as though, well, I felt as though when they start doing that, the public might have a lot more reality in the expectations around the airport. So let's watch this space. As Martin said, that goes for the hapu side and the hapu things as well. Yeah.
Am I hearing that we are generally in agreement with this? In a roundabout way. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.